Andrew Ramey Cato IV, who went by Drew, was born on May 16, 1989, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Augusta, Georgia. From the very beginning, Drew was a light in the lives of everyone who knew him. He was described as kind, loyal, and full of life. At 28, he worked as a fitter for fire tech and took great pride in it. But above all, he was a devoted father to his children, Aliana and Hayden, who were the center of his world. Friends and family say Drew had a way of making ordinary moments feel extraordinary. He loved hosting cookouts, bringing people together with food, laughter, and warmth. He was dependable and always the first to help anyone in need. He shared a deep bond with his siblings, Morgan and Paul, and considered his sister his best friend. By all accounts, he had a great life until a horrible tragedy occurred in the spring of 2018. On May 5th, Drew left for work at International Paper on Mike Paget Highway. He finished his shift around 11:30 p.m., but then strangely never made it home. He had been driving his sister's 2011 gray Ford Focus and was supposed to return it on Monday so they could run errands together, but he never showed up. At that point, his family knew something was wrong. That Monday, they reported him missing to the Richmond County Sheriff's Office. What followed was a massive search effort. Volunteers used drones, four-wheelers, boats, and tracking dogs to scour the area. Even the woods where his phone last pinged was searched. A few days later, the car Drew had been driving was found abandoned near Brickyard Ponds. Inside, investigators found a tangled fishing line, red dirt, and red clay. Suspicious for a car Drew had just detailed and typically kept spotless. Desperate for answers, Drew's family offered a $3,100 reward, but there were still no solid leads, until May 24th, when the case took a horrifying turn. Drew's ex-girlfriend, 23-year-old Blake Wolf, had become a person of interest in the case. However, she tried her best to deflect suspicion by telling investigators that Drew was suicidal and using drugs. She changed her story multiple times, but on May 24th, she finally broke. She admitted that she and her friend, 23-year-old Devin Stringfield, had murdered Drew in a premeditated plot. Curtis Cato, Drew's brother, later confirmed there had been ongoing tension over custody. Investigators then learned what happened to Drew after he left work on the night he was murdered. After leaving work, Drew went to speak with Blake. He was concerned about Hayden's well-being and had decided to seek full custody. According to family members, his relationship with Blake had long been strained, and he even threatened to report her to the Department of Family and Children's Services. Under the pretense of wanting to talk, Blake lured him in. Unknowingly, Stringfield was waiting with a gun equipped with a silencer. He shot Drew in the head and then continued shooting him multiple times. Together, they stuffed Drew's body into the toolbox of Devin's truck, the same toolbox that witnesses said had been emptied just days earlier. They abandoned the car Drew had been driving and drove across the state line to bury him in a remote wooded area in McCormick County, South Carolina. Just 2 days later, on May 27th, investigators followed a tip to a remote area in McCormick County. There, they found Drew's body, and an autopsy confirmed he had been shot multiple times. Both Blake Wolf and Devin Stringfield were arrested and charged with malice murder, second-degree murder, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. In 2020, they each pleaded guilty to malice murder and were sentenced to life in prison plus 5 years. They will be eligible for parole after 30 years. As part of their plea agreement, they are barred from contacting any member of Drew's family, including Hayden. If Hayden chooses to speak with his mother after turning 18, Wolf will have to petition the court. Both defendants also agreed never to speak publicly about the crime or profit from it in any way. After her conviction, Drew's father, Andrew Cato III, was granted custody of Hayden. Wolf is now serving her sentence at Pulaski State Prison, while Stringfield is incarcerated at Phillips State Prison, but the case didn't end there. Blake's mother, Virginia Wolf Reynolds, became the third person arrested in connection to Drew's death. Blake had told her about the murder the day after it happened, but she never reported it. Reynolds was charged with concealing a death and later pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 10 years of probation with strict conditions, including a curfew, mandatory employment, a $10,000 fine, no contact with Drew's family, and potential prison time if she violates the terms. Out of their grief, Drew's loved ones created Project Drew, a nonprofit dedicated to helping families of missing persons and advocating for victims' rights across the central Savannah River area. The organization keeps Drew's legacy alive and supports others walking through the same nightmare his family endured. At age 55, Edward Keith Cruey, who went by Eddie, was living with his wife Sandra Cruey in the Glen Hills area of Augusta, Georgia. Friends and family described him as kind and loyal, someone who never let hardship dull his warmth. But behind the walls of his home, something dark was building. Then, on November 23, 2019, the worst imaginable nightmare occurred when Sandra struck him in the head 8 to 10 times with a steel horseshoe stake. She later told a neighbor that the two had fought that night and that Eddie had chased her with a knife. Sandra claimed she acted in self-defense, grabbing the stake and striking him repeatedly, even after he got back up. Afterward, she pushed his body into a shallow, pre-dug hole beside the carport, covered him with lime, and buried him under just 2 feet of soil. For more than 2 months, Eddie's body lay there, slowly decomposing in the Georgia heat. Eddie's family quickly grew concerned. His stepmother, Kelly Cruey, said they began contacting authorities almost immediately. On December 21st, neighbors saw Sandra discarding a mattress, carpet, and clothing on the roadside. Kelly alerted investigators, asking, "She's throwing these things out, are y'all gonna come get it?" But she was told there was no reason to. Undeterred, she kept calling every week, begging for someone to look into it. It was even noticed that a growing swarm of buzzards had begun circling Eddie's home. Still, no action was taken. Emails later showed that Eddie's parents had contacted investigators at least 9 separate times, but each time they were met with silence. Meanwhile, Sandra claimed Eddie had walked away with just $200 and a sleeping bag to have Thanksgiving dinner with a friend. But that friend would later have been his best friend, Lisa Sesteri Harkins, who had known him for 40 years, and she hadn't heard from him. When Eddie's parents arrived from Virginia in December, Sandra still hadn't reported him missing, even though 3 weeks had passed. There had been red flags long before his disappearance. Just months earlier, in mid-2019, Sandra was arrested for domestic violence after allegedly hitting Eddie in the head with a hammer. A protective order was filed. Eddie's family made sure to mention this when filing the missing persons report, but even then, no search was launched. What makes Eddie's case even more heartbreaking is the fact that law enforcement may have had enough information to act much sooner. Under Georgia law, investigators need probable cause to obtain a search warrant, reasonable evidence that a crime occurred, and that evidence exists at a specific location. In this case, they had plenty of warning signs: a documented history of violence, Sandra's refusal to file a missing persons report, conflicting stories, neighbors reporting suspicious behavior and foul odors, and even buzzards circling the property. Eddie's family and friends raised these alarms again and again, yet nothing was done. Had investigators taken those calls seriously, they might have had a legal pathway to search the home long before February 2020. Instead, Sandra remained free, and Eddie's body stayed buried in that shallow grave for months. Sandra's behavior had become increasingly suspicious. She was sitting on the carport at all hours of the day, rarely leaving the house, and avoiding visitors at all costs. It was as if she was guarding a secret just beneath the soil. Then, in February 2020, months after Eddie disappeared, his body was finally discovered beside the carport and was identified using his fingerprints. The coroner confirmed Eddie died from blunt force trauma. Sandra Lee Dales was then arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, and concealing a death. Her bond was denied, and she remained in custody as the case made its way to trial. At trial, her attorneys argued Sandra was a battered woman acting in self-defense. They brought in a social worker who testified that Sandra suffered from PTSD and battered person syndrome. But prosecutors highlighted the inconsistencies and reminded jurors that Sandra had a pending charge for hitting Eddie in the head with a hammer just months before his death. In the end, the jury found her guilty of felony murder and concealing a death, but reduced the malice murder charge to voluntary manslaughter, taking the domestic abuse testimony into account. Sandra Lee Dales was then sentenced to 20 years in prison for the voluntary manslaughter of Edward Keith Cruey and 10 more years for concealing his death. The sentences are being served concurrently, meaning she will only serve a total of 20 years. She was 58 years old at the time of sentencing and is expected to be 78 upon her release. For Eddie's loved ones, the pain of losing him is compounded by how long it took for anyone to listen. They believe that if their early warnings had been taken seriously, Eddie might have been found much sooner. Instead, they were left searching, calling, and pleading, while the man they cherished lay buried just steps from where the nightmare began. Mackenzie Nicole Cowell was born on April 1, 1992. At age 17, she lived in Orondo, Washington, and was a senior at Wenatchee High School. She danced on the school team, worked as a model, and was studying cosmetology at the Academy of Hair Design. By all accounts, she was responsible, serious about her future, and deeply loved by her family and friends. On February 9, 2010, Mackenzie told classmates she was stepping out for about 15 minutes and would be right back. She left the academy and was caught on surveillance video walking to her car, a red Pontiac Grand Prix. She even texted her boyfriend, "Hey, what's up?" as she drove away. That sadly was the last time anyone heard from her. By 5 p.m., when she missed dinner with her dad, Reed Cowell, alarm bells started ringing. As calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, panic set in. That night, a rancher called police to report a red car abandoned near his driveway, 40 miles from Mackenzie's home, far from her normal route. Inside the car were her purse and clothes, but there was no sign of Mackenzie. Her phone, keys, and debit card were also missing, and only one set of shoe prints led away from the car. Search teams, including the FBI, were brought in. 4 days later, a passerby found Mackenzie's body near the Columbia River at Crescent Bar. She was fully clothed, lying with her feet in the water just 50 yards from a vacant house. A knife was still lodged in her shoulder. Nearby, police found trash bags and duct tape. An autopsy revealed she had suffered blunt force trauma and was stabbed and strangled. The killer had also tried to mutilate her body. However, investigators were surprised there was no evidence of sexual assault. Once her body was discovered, investigators created a task force made up of local and federal agencies and interviewed over 800 people. They initially looked at Mackenzie's boyfriend and her mother's boyfriend, both of whom were quickly ruled out. Then came a strange tip from a college student and known drug informant named Liz Reed. Liz claimed Mackenzie was killed in a case of mistaken identity by 2 local dealers, Sam Cuevas and Emmanuel Soros, who thought she was an informant. She even said they made a snuff film of the murder, but later retracted that part of her story. It looked like a promising lead, but neither Cuevas nor Soros matched DNA at the scene, and both were eventually cleared. Then came a name that changed the direction of the case: Christopher Scott Wilson. Wilson was a 29-year-old classmate of Mackenzie's at the beauty school. Several people told police that he had a fascination with death and serial killers. He even had a Hannibal Lecter tattoo and had once worked at a funeral home. When police brought him in for questioning, he claimed he barely knew Mackenzie and voluntarily gave a sample of his DNA. Those DNA samples came back with a match. Investigators then searched Wilson's old apartment, and with the use of luminol, Mackenzie's blood was found beneath the carpet and padding. It turned out Wilson had moved out, but investigators were able to retrieve damning evidence. Around the time Mackenzie left school, Wilson was also caught on surveillance, leaving just 1 minute behind her. Witnesses later placed a man matching his description near her abandoned car. Investigators were then shocked when they searched his computer, and the majority of his searches were about serial killers. They even found photos on his laptop showing his ex-girlfriend, Tessa Schulman, posing on the same spot where Mackenzie's blood was found, pretending to be dead. Tessa later claimed she had no idea about the blood and that Wilson told her how to pose. Then came even more strange behavior. Tessa's phone contained a video where Wilson showed her the apartment, mentioning considering what happened while trying to get his deposit back.
Pretty clean. Video me, just get away. Is it clean?
For what happening? Clean considering? Yeah, it's clean considering.
As she later told her new boyfriend to pray for her because something bad had happened. Despite all this, Wilson maintained his innocence. His defense attorney, none other than John Henry Brown, the same man who had once defended Ted Bundy. Brown tried to argue that the blood had been planted, that other suspects hadn't been ruled out, and that Wilson was being railroaded. He even claimed there was no motive. Eventually, Wilson was charged with second-degree murder, but as jury selection began, and with evidence piling up, he took a plea deal. He pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter, first-degree robbery, and second-degree assault. He was sentenced to 14 years and 3 months in prison, the maximum allowed for the charges. But even after signing his name to the plea, he claimed he was innocent and that he only pled guilty because he feared he wouldn't get a fair trial in the small, emotionally charged community. Christopher Scott Wilson was released from prison on December 11, 2023, after serving just over 11 years behind bars. Given the high-profile nature of his case and the public attention it has garnered, it's plausible that Wilson has chosen to keep his whereabouts private. To this day, he maintains he didn't kill Mackenzie, but we all know DNA doesn't lie, especially when it comes from a pool of blood in the suspect's apartment. In the early hours of February 21, 2006, a quiet Mesa, Arizona neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunfire. A neighbor called 911 after hearing 5 rapid shots followed by screams. What officers found inside the home near Ellsworth and Baseline Roads would haunt the community forever. 5 people, including 2 children, had been shot and killed execution style. The victims were 32-year-old Tammy Lovell, her boyfriend, 30-year-old Stephen Duffy, Stephen's younger brother, 18-year-old Shane Duffy, and Tammy's 2 children, 15-year-old Cassandra and 10-year-old Jacob. All 5 were gunned down in what police quickly determined was a targeted killing. The suspected motive? Silence. And the man responsible? Their former boss, William Craig Miller. Miller owned a Scottsdale restoration company that specialized in cleaning up after fires and floods. But behind the scenes, he was committing crimes of his own. In late 2005, Miller deliberately set fire to his own home in a scheme to collect insurance money. Ironically, the man who made a living restoring fire-damaged homes had become an arsonist himself. Stephen Duffy, one of his employees, helped him set the blaze. But what Miller didn't count on was Tammy Lovell. She came forward, tipping off investigators. Both she and Stephen agreed to cooperate with authorities. Miller was then indicted for arson and insurance fraud, and his trial was just around the corner. Desperate to stop them from testifying, Miller tried to hire 4 different men to kill Stephen and Tammy. When they refused, he took matters into his own hands. On the night of February 20th, Miller drove to the Mesa home armed with 3 guns, 2 later confirmed to be his. He entered the house and murdered each person inside, one by one. 10-year-old Jacob was shot in the forehead at point-blank range. His sister Cassandra, their mother Tammy, Stephen, and Shane all were executed in cold blood. Less than a week later, Miller reported a break-in at his rental home. Investigators say it was staged to make it look like he, too, was a target. But instead of throwing suspicion off, police found bullets and other evidence that tied him directly to the murders. Miller initially agreed to plead guilty, but later changed his mind. He fired his attorney and tried to represent himself in court. A judge then ordered a psychiatric evaluation. His attorneys claimed he had bipolar disorder and a troubled past, but he was ruled competent to stand trial. The murder trial began in August 2011, 5 years after the killings. 4 men testified that Miller had approached them to commit the murders, and jurors also heard about the staged robbery and the damning physical evidence. It took the jury less than 3 hours to find him guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of burglary, and 4 counts of solicitation to commit murder. He was sentenced to death and remains on death row in Florence, Arizona. Before the trial even began, Miller had already pleaded guilty to the arson and insurance fraud. For that, he received 16 years in prison and was ordered to pay over $500,000 in restitution. But no sentence can undo the devastation of 5 innocent lives being wiped out in a single night. Tammy Lovell, a mother who did the right thing by coming forward, paid the ultimate price, along with her children and those she loved. Tiffany Eunick was born on August 26, 1992, and lived in Pembroke Park, Florida. At just 6 years old, Tiffany was full of life, lively, bright, and always smiling. She was described by her loved ones as sweet, energetic, and kind-hearted. But on July 28, 1999, her short life was taken in a horrifying and brutal act that left a community in shock. That day, Tiffany had been dropped off by her mother to spend time at the home of family friend Kathleen Grossette Tate. Kathleen was babysitting Tiffany, but left her alone with her 12-year-old son, Lionel Tate, while she reportedly took a nap. Lionel was a large boy for his age, over 170 pounds, and had a reputation for being aggressive and acting out at school. He and Tiffany had been left unsupervised in the living room, supposedly watching television. Hours later, Lionel woke his mother and told her that Tiffany wasn't breathing. She called 911, and Tiffany was rushed to the hospital, but it was far too late, and she was pronounced dead. The extent of Tiffany's injuries immediately raised suspicion. The medical examiner determined that her injuries included a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, a perforated bowel, and broken ribs. Her body also showed signs of blunt force trauma and internal bleeding. The severity of the injuries led the examiner to conclude that they were consistent with a fall from a 3-story building, not the result of ordinary roughhousing. Lionel told police that he had been mimicking professional wrestling moves he saw on television. He said he had body slammed Tiffany, elbow dropped her, and had her in a headlock as part of what he called play. But prosecutors argued that this was not play, it was a sustained, violent beating. Neighbors testified that Lionel was known for bullying younger children, and the prosecution pointed out that his story shifted over time. When Kathleen was asked what happened during the incident, she admitted to hearing Tiffany scream, but instead of checking in, she reportedly told the girl to shut up. During the trial, prosecutors painted a chilling picture of what happened. He argued that Lionel wanted to get Tiffany out of the way because he had developed a crush on her mother. Testimony revealed that after Tiffany died, Lionel showed little emotion. According to Tiffany's mother, when she told Lionel her daughter had passed away, he simply shrugged and rolled his eyes. The next day, he even asked if he could move in with her and have Tiffany's toys. Lionel was tried as an adult and, in 2001, became the youngest American citizen ever sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal defense strategy during Lionel's original trial, led by attorney Jim Lewis, leaned heavily on the idea that Lionel had been imitating professional wrestling and didn't intend to hurt Tiffany. The World Wrestling Federation publicly rejected this narrative, calling it a contrived hoax, and prosecutors pushed back hard against the suggestion that Tiffany's injuries were accidental. They argued the case had nothing to do with wrestling, it was about unchecked rage and violence. The ruling sparked international debate over juvenile justice. Critics, including human rights organizations and child psychologists, argued that a 12-year-old could not fully comprehend the consequences of such actions and should not be subjected to adult sentencing standards. Others believe that the brutality of Tiffany's murder demanded the harshest penalty. In 2004, Lionel's conviction was overturned on appeal after a court ruled that he had not received a proper mental competency evaluation during the original trial. He eventually accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder, and was released with 10 years of probation. But his return to freedom was short-lived. Just a year later, in 2005, Lionel was arrested again, this time for armed robbery. He was accused of holding a pizza delivery man at gunpoint and assaulting a resident inside the home where the robbery took place. He was charged with armed robbery, armed burglary with battery, and violation of probation. In 2006, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for violating his probation and 10 years for the robbery to be served concurrently. His release date is currently set for September 2030. Lionel had also violated the terms of his house arrest earlier in 2004 when he was found outside his home carrying an 8-inch knife. That incident raised concerns about his ability to comply with supervision and highlighted the risk he still posed to others. While some initially saw Lionel as a misguided child who made a tragic mistake, his continued criminal behavior led many to reconsider that narrative. Now, more than 2 decades later, the memory of Tiffany lives on in her family and those who loved her.